All right. Thank you very much, Frank, and all the victims. Again, this Capital Forum is co-sponsored by the Washington, D.C. Falun Dafa Practitioners Association and also the Global Center for Quitting the Chinese Communist Party. Before we keep going on, we would like to invite the next part of our forum, the Radical Changes in China, Ms. Yi Rong, who is the chairperson of Global Service Center for Quitting Chinese Communist Party. She came today especially from New York. Please come up here. And also Mr. Wei Jinshen. He is, I think everybody here knows him, renowned political dissident, China Democratic Movement leader. Please, Mr. Wei, would you please come up here? Thank you. And also Mr. Dr. Joe Bosco. He is the U.S.-China Task Force Center for National Interest and the Senior Associate Center for Strategic and International Studies. This is Dr. Bosco. And also Mr. Richard Fisher. He is the Senior Fellow of International Assessment and the Strategy Center, Totalitarian Export via Global Expansion. And of course, Dr. Nie. He's the chairperson of the Mechanical Engineering Department at Catholic University of America. So those are the five panelists for our next session. And forgot to mention lawyer Hugo Peng. He was a China rights lawyer, the state, and also Dr. Wang Zhiyuan. He's the president of a World Organization to investigate the persecution of Falun Gong.
老王等一下现在坐不下哈。下一期让那个张一姐讲。
Okay. Actually, we have another speaker, but she cannot come today. She is Zhang Yijie. I think Nancy Neal is going to read her statement. Yeah, thanks.
I'm going to read her speech. Arrest Jiang Zemin, disintegrate the Chinese Communist Party, enter into a new era. 65 years ago today, the United Nations designated this day as International Human Rights Day. And down the road, it enacted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, solemnly declaring to the world that men and women of all countries in the world, regardless of religion or race, are entitled to basic rights and freedoms, including life, liberty, personal security, and the freedom of speech, association, assembly. However, China has paid no heed to the declaration, and under the regime of former Chinese Communist Party leader Jiang Zemin, has become one of the worst no human rights country in the world. The brutal repression of tens of millions of Falun Gong practitioners by Jiang's criminal group has become the 21st century's largest human rights case and the human rights disaster in the world. Since the persecution of Falun Gong began in 1999, Jiang's criminal group have utilized the entire state apparatus to orchestrate nationwide forced organ harvesting from living Falun Gong practitioners. Members of the international community have said that it is a new form of evil on this planet. The Chinese regime controls all facets of society, from nationwide labor camps, prisons, brainwashing centers, the military, politics, the judiciary, to the medical profession and the business community. It has worked with a dark underworld to form a nationwide network harvesting the vital organs from living Falun Gong practitioners. They sell organs, carry on all sorts of experiments on living Falun Gong practitioners, and traffic in dead bodies and living Falun Gong practitioners to reap high profits. In particular, the health care system of the army and armed police has taken the lead in this grotesque act. They are practically killing people like ants. During the 16 years of persecuted Falun Gong, the number of practitioners slaughtered through the means of organ harvesting is believed to be in millions. Today, hundreds of millions of Falun Gong practitioners have entered the 17th years of hardship. They have endured suffering for such a long period of time. We are doing all we can to tell the world the facts of the persecution using peaceful and rational methods. Today, we pay tribute to the documented 4,000 Falun Gong practitioners who lost their lives by saying true to their faith, and the millions of missing Falun Gong practitioners who were slaughtered by their organs by CCP, Chinese Communist Party, during this 17 years of persecution. Human rights are universal values of humanity. We believe that protecting and upholding human rights is the responsibility of all people. To this effect, it's all of our responsibility to bring stop the crime against humanity carried out by the Chinese Communist regime, and in particular, the crimes of Jiang Zemin. Jiang launched the brutal persecution of Falun Gong more than 16 years ago, and it continues to this day. He has committed crime against humanity, torture, and genocide. Jiang Zemin has not only violated international law, but also Chinese law. Starting from the end of May 2015 to December 2015, more than 200,000 Falun Gong practitioners and their families and relatives have used their real names to file criminal complaints against Jiang Zemin at China's Supreme Procuratorate. And it's not just the Falun Gong practitioners in China, but around the world who have joined in on this effort. Today, there are 210 million Chinese people who have quit the Communist Party and its affiliate organizations. The end of the party is near. After more than 16 years of brutal persecution, the CCP has fallen off a cliff, and there's no way for it to make a comeback. This is its destiny now. We believe that God will never give the CCP any chance to atone for his crimes. It does not have any chance at this moment, nor have any reason to exist for committing these heinous crimes. Under the current communist regime, the talks about the rule of law, the political reform, the economic reform, the national revival are all in vain. The Chinese people have completely lost confidence in the Chinese Communist Party. They have awakened. The corruption of officials in the CCP have caused the party's destruction. Such a party has no ability to win the trust of the people and to revive itself. Now China is in a historic moment of great change. Conditions are now ripe to arrest Jiang Zemin. It's time for China to make a transition to a nation of peace that is governed by the rule of law. In this, we hope the Chinese regime will, first, comprehensively establish and investigate the 200,000 criminal complaints against Jiang and provide security and legal support to the plaintiffs. Second, immediately arrest Jiang Zemin and announce all his crimes in the persecution of Falun Gong, publicly convict his crimes and sentence him by the law. Third, dissolve the CCP and end its one-party dictatorship. Now is the time for the name of Falun Gong to be restored in China. Now is the time for the Chinese people to stand together to bring Jiang to justice. Now is the time for the Chinese people to say no more to the communist regime. Now is the time for new leadership to take over in China, ushering in an era of peace. We believe that whoever takes the helm of China will be helped by God, and that he will grant it the wisdom to see China into a new peaceful era. China's glorious 5,000 years history will start anew. The brutal persecution of Falun Gong is also a persecution against all of mankind. Jiang's criminal group has linked the persecution of Falun Gong to economic benefits to not only prevent the political parties, organizations of some countries from criticizing him and make them keep their silent attitudes towards Jiang's countless evil crimes, but also as a tool to give other nations a bad impression of Falun Gong and thus unable to make good and justice choices. In reality, this world has no real benefits because there are no permanent benefits ever. The real benefits in the world today has two patterns, good and evil, justice and injustice. Every country and government, every party and group, and every life and death is all in these two patterns. The choice is inevitable. There is only one choice between good and evil, no middle road and no third way. We sincerely hope there will be more nations, political parties, economic entities that will condemn the CCP's persecution of Falun Gong. Despite the economic benefits pressure, it is important that they defend human rights and justice. One day, when the CCP comes to an end, we hope that no other nations will face the same fate as the communist regime. The CCP is collapsing. Before that day comes, we hope to get more international support, solidarity, and help. We hope people can wake up and stand on the side of truth and justice and have a bright future. The CCP is coming to an end, and the evil will be liquidated. We hope the current Chinese regime can take the moral high ground and arrest Jiang Zemin, disintegrate the dictatorship of the CCP, and be brave and bold enough to create a new China without the Communist Party. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. She was just reading Ms. Zhang Yijie's speech. She was a spokesperson for World Organization of Crimes of Jiang Zemin. Okay, so now let's first invite Mr. Wei Jinshen to give us a speech. Yeah. Yeah, that's fine.
翻译，你到上面翻译吧。首先感谢老聂和法轮功的朋友请我来参加这个会议，很高兴。今天是国际人权日，这个活动非常有意义。
So first, I want to express my gratitude to Professor Nie and the Falun Gong practitioners who invite me to attend this conference. Today is the World Human Rights Day, so it's very significant.
刚才听到几个姐妹也都是蹲过监狱、受过苦的，咱们都是难友了。
So I have heard several sisters who were in prison of the communist regime. So in that sense, I was in prison too, and we shared the same suffering.
听了他们的讲述呢，我发现现在中国的这个人权状况，包括监狱里的情况，确实比以前糟糕得多，越来越退步了。
After I heard they tell what had happened to them in jails. And I realized the situation in Chinese jails and human rights in China as well has been going worse. It's really going backwards.
昨天呢，联合国的人权委员会下面那个反酷刑委员会发表了一份报告，指责中国政府这个在大量的、广泛的滥用酷刑，而且要求呢，中国对酷刑问题加以改善。而且要求中国释放一些维权律师。
Yesterday, there was a report by the United Nations Committee on the Cruelty. They talked about the cruelty in China, as well as request the release of some rights defense lawyers.
我想在最近几年，确实在监狱里遭受酷刑， 包括在监狱外边，就没进监狱就已经遭受很多酷刑的这样的人，事例非常普遍，甚至连文艺媒体里头就是那些电影电视里头都有很多。
I think in recent years, there were many people in prison as well as those outside prison has been suffering cruelty and torturing. They are so massive that even those cases are reflected through the movies and the television series in China.
但是呢，中国的外交部发言人今天马上做出反应，他就说，那都不对，说中国人权状况很好，监狱没有酷刑，我们做了很大的努力。总之就是在掩盖。
However, today the spokesperson for the Foreign Affairs Ministry of China sort of rebuffed this whole thing, and they say there is no torture in China, no torture in Chinese prison. Overall, we have done everything right.
咱们这几位姐妹就是很好的证明嘛，她们是刚刚最近一些年才刚刚经受这些酷刑，包括很多的法轮功的朋友和其他各界的朋友都可以证明，包括你像高志胜啊、艾薇薇这种名人在监狱里头遭受酷刑，所以这都是大家都知道的现实，他们还在那说没有，这是撒谎嘛。
But those several sisters who have testified the torture in China, as well as many other Falun Gong practitioners and other people such as lawyer Gao Zhisheng and artist Ai Weiwei, they were even famous and they would still suffer the torture, the cruelty of torture. And those people are the evidence of torture in China.
现在看来不仅是对法轮功的兄弟姐妹啊，对所有的中国其他各个方面的维权的呀，那个各个方面的异议人士啊，包括这次报告里还提到，有很多政治犯在监狱里头莫名其妙的死掉了，需要中国政府做出解释，其中也包括法轮功的一些朋友。
And then the torture has not only applied to the Falun Gong practitioners, but also the rights defender lawyers and dissidents. As a matter of fact, in this United Nations report about torture, and they even mentioned that there were some political prisoners died in prison without knowing a rightful reason. And those people, including Falun Gong practitioners.
有些人提出疑问啊，说中国现在既然那么发达，经济那么好，各方面都那么好，为什么还要加紧迫害老百姓呢？
Some people have a question, say that look, China is so economically developed, and why they still have to step up to prosecute the people?
老百姓说，你可以跑到英国撒几百亿，跑到美国撒几百亿，跑到非洲又撒出几百亿美元的往外撒钱，那为什么还要迫害中国的老百姓呢？
People say the Chinese government, you could spend tens billions of dollars in United States, tens billions of dollars in Europe, tens billions of dollars in African countries. Why do you have to prosecute the Chinese people?
其实这就反映到我们今天这个题目很重要，就是中国正在进入到一场剧烈的变化之中。
So this really reflected the topic we are discussing today, that there is a radical change in China.
前些年经济发展很好，但是最近几年呢，经济开始下滑。
Several years ago, the economic seems developed, but recently, the economy in China has been slipped down.
很多专家都看出来了，不仅是美国的、外国的、西方的专家，连中国的专家也看出来了。为什么经济下滑呢？就是你那个专制体制，虽然热闹了那么几年，但是也就那么几年的寿命。这个体制就决定它不可能持续的发展，它必然会产生下滑，而且后边可能下滑的速度还会加快。
The many experts, not only in Western countries, but also those people in experts inside of China, has realized that for such a system, and it would only last for a few years, it comes to time for this system regime going downwards, and it's going to move down even faster.
而这个专制政权对人民的迫害积累的越来越多，老百姓的反抗也越来越强烈，包括很多受到权利受到侵犯的，也有财产受到侵犯的，都反抗越来越多。这个时候呢，共产党就加强了这个迫害。
So as the people, more people has been, the more suppression result, more people's resistance. Those resistance not only come from the average people, but also come from those privileged, as well those people whose rights were violated and whose property were taken away. And the more they struggled, and then the reaction is the more suppression from the Chinese government.
按照共产党的逻辑，他们是不愿意向老百姓做让步的，也不愿意进行真正的政治体制的改革，他们就是希望凭借镇压、凭借这个警察和军队的统治来维持他们的那个生存。
According to the rule of the communist regime, they would not retreat from the people. Their magic, their tools is that through the violence, through the police and the army to suppress the people, and therefore to keep their regime going.
按照他们的想象，好像中国现在问题仅仅是腐败的问题，只要我们把腐败给治理了，那中国的共产党又能多活很多年。
According to their imagination, the problem in China is only due to corruption. If corruption is killed in China, then the communist regime will last for many more years.
但是呢，这个反腐败，首先来讲，老百姓也看出来了，不是真的反腐败，只不过是清除不听那个习近平话的这些人，把大家都清除了，就集中权力，进一步集中权力，想变成第二个毛泽东。
But first, people realize this so-called anti-corruption by Xi Jinping's regime is not really for the purpose of anti-corruption, but was more for Xi Jinping to solidify his power and to expel his competitors, and to make him become a second Mao Zedong.
其实这种不是真诚的反腐败，就是用那个清除异己的方式反腐败呢，在这个时候也引起了共产党内部的巨大的矛盾。
This is not sincere anti-corruption. It was used to expel his competitor in the name of anti-corruption. But this, in turn, has causing a great internal conflict and a fight within the Communist Party.
来自老百姓的反抗，再加上来自共产党内部的反抗，实际上可以说，习近平的政权现在摇摇欲坠。
The struggle from within the Communist Party, as well as the struggle from the Chinese people, give us the conclusion that the Xi Jinping's regime is really about to collapse.
这个政权一旦垮了，后边还有什么能维持共产党的吗？没有了。
When Xi's regime collapsed, what will be able to maintain the rule of a Communist Party? There isn't any.
这就是说，中国正在进入一场巨变之中。现在我们正在走向这个巨大的变化。
So this is indicate a radical change. Changes are in China, and we are working towards that.
在这个时候，我想我们所有的被共产党迫害的兄弟姐妹们，大家都应该团结起来，努力促使共产党尽快的垮台。
At this time, I think it's really important for our brothers and sisters get together, work very hard to force the collapse of the communist regime.
也许我们不能推倒这座塔，但是我们可以挖它一块砖，你挖一块，我挖一块，共产党倒的就更快了。
Maybe we cannot push over this tower, but each of us could take away one brick from that tower, and when each of us pitch in, then the regime of the communist will collapse.
还是咱们大家说了很多年的那句话：共产党不垮台，什么问题也解决不了。不但是那个法轮功的问题，不但是民主派的问题， 甚至你连个环境保护的问题都解决不了，所以共产党必须垮台。
So still, what we have been talking about for years is without the collapse of the communist regime, all the issues will not be solved. Not only the prosecution of the Falun Gong practitioners, but even other issues such as the environment. So we have to work together for the collapse of the communist regime.
咱们做的工作从各个方向往这个方向努力，但是最终的目标只有一个。只有共产党垮台了，咱们大家才能得到解放，全中国人民才能得到解放。
So we are really working for the same goal. Only when the communist regime collapsed, then there is hope for the liberation of all the people in China.
谢谢大家。
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Wei. And our next speaker will be Dr. Joe Bosco, and he's a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the U.S.-China Task Force at the Center for the National Interest. So let's welcome Dr. Bosco.
Thank you. It's an honor to be with you with this distinguished, long-suffering group, particularly on Human Rights Day. The title of this forum that I was given is Radical Changes in China, Crisis of the CCP and Its Impacts on U.S.-Sino Relations. That title suggests the obvious fact that the nature of the ruling Chinese Communist Party affects not only what happens within China, but in its relations with the United States and the world. Yet the entire premise of the original opening to China was that if the U.S. and the rest of the world changed our attitude toward China, then China itself would change. We did dramatically change our approach when the old-line anti-communist Richard Nixon met with Mao Zedong in 1972. In launching his opening, Nixon was carrying out the policy reversal he had proposed in his 1967 Foreign Affairs article. This is what he said then. Taking the long view, we simply cannot afford to leave China forever outside the family of nations, there to nurture its fantasies, cherish its hates, and threaten its neighbors. There is no place on this small planet for 1 billion of its potentially most able people to live in angry isolation. So starting with Nixon, we revolutionized our policy toward China and opened the door to the flow of Western aid, investment, trade, technology, and advice on how to improve its economic system and even its military capabilities. And China itself has changed in many ways, some good, some not so good. The most evident of the beneficial reforms is that, thanks in large part to all that Western trade and investment, millions of Chinese have been lifted out of poverty. It is also true that the Chinese people enjoy greater economic and social freedom relatively today than they did during the worst years of the Mao era. But in the political realm, the area of human rights, much in communist China has not changed. The Chinese people must be as careful as ever in what they say about their leaders and the political system under which they are forced to live. Dissent or criticism will result in various forms of punishment, ranging from loss of jobs and professional positions and income to beatings and imprisonment under conditions sometimes leading to death. You in this room know that very well. A decade and a half after Mao passed from the scene, China's leaders showed that his legacy still lived on. Deng Xiaoping, China's great reformer, made great strides in opening China's economic system, and he stirred hopes in the Chinese populace that political reform would surely follow. But on June 4th, 1989, the People's Liberation Army turned its guns and tanks on the young, hopeful people in Tiananmen Square, and ended that generation's China dream. So while the Marxism part of Marxist-Leninism, the economics of communism, has evolved significantly in today's China, the Leninism part, the one-party dictatorship, is very much alive and well. And the Communist Party makes every effort to control how the Chinese are permitted to express themselves on religious, spiritual, and intellectual matters, even on how they plan their families. A major change in China's development that has not been good is its massive military buildup over the last 3 decades, far beyond what the country needs for normal defensive purposes. And as those military capabilities have dramatically risen, so have indications of an increasingly aggressive foreign policy. While Beijing never tires of stoking the fires of nationalism by reminding its people of Japanese aggression in the 1930s and 40s, it is communist China, not modern, peaceful, democratic Japan, which most resembles imperial Japan of that period. China's 9-dash line, claiming most of the South China Sea and its vast resources, evokes Japan's greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. The pattern of Chinese behavior, the increasing threats and actions against the United States in the region, and the inflammatory rhetoric that comes out of Beijing cannot be the kind of Chinese conduct that Nixon envisioned when he launched his historic opening to China. Despite 4 decades of generous engagement under 8 U.S. administrations of both parties, in certain fundamental ways, the China we confront today is very much like the China we faced under Mao. Even though China has been welcomed within the family of nations, the PRC, in Nixon's words, still nurtures its fantasies, cherishes its hates, and threatens its neighbors. Instead of a China living, as Nixon put it, in angry isolation, we have a China thriving in angry and defiant integration. At the time Nixon made his opening, he knew he was undertaking a strategic gamble, in the words of one of his aides, hoping that China would in fact change for the better as the world opened up to it. A few years later, however, as China's outlook toward the world remained as suspicious, paranoid, and hostile as it had been under Mao, but was now incomparably more powerful militarily, Nixon concluded we may have created a Frankenstein's monster. But of course, Nixon didn't create the monster. It has existed ever since Mao and the Chinese Communist Party seized control of China. The Chinese people have long suffered under the communist regime's monstrous behavior. Again, people in this room have experienced that firsthand. The harassment, imprisonment, torture, and killing of Falun Gong practitioners is just one dramatic example of the cruel ways the Communist Party treats its people. Human organ harvesting is another. Just yesterday, as Mr. Wei pointed out, the United Nations Human Rights Commission, Committee Against Torture, released its report on China, confirming allegations of unlawful detentions of human rights advocates and their lawyers, including mistreatment and torture, resulting in deaths of some detainees. Yes, the CCP has succeeded in building China's economic and military power, with the generous and sometimes short-sighted help from the West. Yet, the PRC is not secure in those achievements because it knows it does not enjoy genuine political legitimacy in the eyes of the Chinese people. That is why there are over 100,000 civil protests across China each year, and why it spends even more on internal security than it does in its massive military budget. The Chinese Communist Party is afraid of the Chinese people. Chinese leaders also know they have not yet earned the general respect of the international community. Not when the UN condemns its human rights record. Not when its closest ally is the despicable regime in North Korea. and it is associated with many of the world's other major human rights violators. Not when, until one recent exception, the only Nobel Prize winners China can produce are the ones it sends in exile, like the Dalai Lama, or to prison, like Liu Xiaobao. Not when the communist regime must stir hostile, anti-US, anti-Japan, anti-Western nationalism as a substitute for the political legitimacy it lacks. Not when it threatens its neighbors in the East and South China Seas and threatens the US homeland if we come to their defense. China today may consider itself a great power, but politically and morally, it is not a great power. Despite the glistening skyscrapers and the imposing ballistic missiles, modern China is not yet even a normal country. It has been unable so far to match the evolution from authoritarianism to democracy, as the Confucian societies in Taiwan and South Korea have managed to do. That is what really rankles Beijing about Taiwan. It has shown that a Chinese society is perfectly capable of ruling itself, something the people of Hong Kong are also eager to prove. But of course, the big brothers of the CCP believe they have some quasi-divine right to control the people. China will achieve true greatness only when it is no longer a threat to its own people and the region. China may have stood up, as Mao said, but it has yet to stand uprightly. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Bosco. So our next speaker will be Ms. Yi Rong. She's the chairperson of the Global Service Center for Quitting the Chinese Communist Party. Let's welcome Ms. Rong.
Hello, everyone. 大家好. I would like to thank Professor Nie and other organizers for arranging this forum here at the Capital Visitor Center on occasion of Human Rights Day. This is an important day for us to look back at how well our communities reflect the value that we share. My name is Rong Yi. I'm the chairperson of the Global Service Center for Quitting the Chinese Communist Party. We are a charitable organization registered here in the United States, and we're building freedom in China. In China, we call ourselves the Tuidang Center. The mission of the Tuidang Center is to educate people about the destructive nature of communism, to assist all Chinese people worldwide to renounce the Chinese Communist Party and its affiliated organizations, to investigate and document the crimes communism has committed against humanity, and the Tuidang Center coordinated the Tuidang movement. Tuidang has seen over 220 million Chinese people withdraw from the Chinese Communist Party. Tuidang is not a political movement. It does not offer any political answers. Instead, it's a spiritual awakening. Tuidang offers Chinese people something much more fundamental: hope. The greatest problem facing China today is a decline in moral standards, characters in the Chinese people that communism has caused. In withdrawing from the Chinese Communist Party, Chinese people cleansed their conscience of communism and began the path of renewing their moral character. I will explain the objectives of Tuidang in more depth momentarily. Some people may ask, how can you have 220 million people withdraw from the Chinese Communist Party when there are only 85 million Communist Party members? This is a very good question. In Tuidang, we talk about 三退 or 3 withdrawals. The Chinese Communist Party has about 85 million members. The Communist Youth League has about 73 million members, and the Young Pioneer has about 130 million members. But in regards to the Young Pioneer, that 130 million is simply children in China between 6 and 14 years old. What this shows is that almost every person in China has been forced to join one of the three Chinese Communist Party organizations at some point in their lives. When a child is forced to join, the young pioneers, they raise their fist and make oaths that will give their blood for the Chinese Communist Party, struggle their whole life for the Communist Party, and never betray the Chinese Communist Party. They are not asked to never betray China. They are not asked to struggle for China. From a young age, Chinese people are brainwashed to believe that the Chinese Communist Party is China, and opposing the Chinese Communist Party is betraying China. The oath that all Chinese people have made to the CCP is very deep in their mind, and why renounce it may seem like a simple thing on the surface. It has very profound implications for the lives of Chinese people. In our experience, when Chinese people renounce the oaths they have made to the CCP, they experience a fundamental change. To understand why this is the case, it is important to understand the true nature of the communism and the suffering of the Chinese people under communism. In its 94-year history, the Chinese Communist Party has killed an estimate of 80 million Chinese people. The CCP has conducted endless massacres against the Chinese people. Throughout its 60 years in power, the Chinese Communist Party has used violence to establish and maintain a reign of terror over the Chinese nation. It has forced Chinese people to submit its abnormal culture and its deformed way of thinking. It makes people constantly fight against one another. There is no hope for China under the Chinese Communist Party. In 2004, the Epoch Times published an editorial called The Non-Commentary on the Communist Party. For the first time, it provides a comprehensive analysis of the evil nature of the communists. It asks Chinese people to make a clear separation between themselves and the communism. Within 2 weeks, the newspaper began to receive declarations for withdrawing from the Chinese Communist Party. Less than 1 month later, on the 1st of January 2005, 50 overseas Chinese people signed a joint statement declaring their withdrawal from the CCP, officially launched the Tweedang movement. Tweedang breaks through the years of brainwashing and lies the CCP has used to control the Chinese people. It gives Chinese people the tools they need to begin to think critically for themselves and about the CCP. It is important to constantly clarify this point. The Chinese Communist Party is not China, and it does not represent the wishes of the Chinese people. Chinese people want to be free. With the Tweedang movement, we have an objective: free all Chinese people from communism, including Chinese Communist Party members. Restore the moral character of the Chinese people that has foundation of 5,000 years of profound cultural history, and set the people of China upon the path that will ultimately lead to New China, a China without the Communist Party. What is more, Tweedang is achieving this through entirely peaceful means. For 11 years, we have built up the movement of people who have renounced the Chinese Communist Party, now over 220 million Chinese people. In 2015, the Tweedang movement has begun growing at about 95,000 people per day. What we have achieved today is from the continuous efforts of our volunteers for the past 11 years inside China and overseas. Every Tweedang statement that comes into our website is manually reviewed by a special team of dedicated volunteers. That team works 24/7, and they review statements in real time as they come in. The statements that are not clear or have mistakes in them are sent back for clarification. Only the Tweedang statement that meet our criteria are added to the Tweedang count. So we have been strict about the quality of the declaration of withdrawal that we accepted We stand by this number of 20 million people. Takedown is removing the shackles of fear that CCP used to control the minds of Chinese people. It brings Chinese people together because all Chinese people have suffered immensely under the CCP. Minghui.org is a Falun Gong website that estimates about 20 million Falun Gong practitioners in China, as well as regular people who volunteer their time to help Chinese people quit the CCP. We have many tens of thousands of underground print shops in China. Our volunteers print the non-commentaries and distribute them. Some volunteers call police stations and government officials, ask them to withdraw from the CCP. Some volunteers send mass text messages to Chinese people. We have volunteers in cities around the world. Whenever Chinese people leave any place that tourists from China to visit or work, no matter where it is around the world, we have Takedown volunteers. They are to meet them to help them quit the CCP, whether it is in Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, Japan, Australia, Germany, France, Israel, and of course, in the United States. Our volunteers collect statements of withdrawal to receive and submit it to our online database. Volunteers in China need to use special software to break through the internet firewall. The Takedown movement is bringing great changes inside China. I'll tell you a brief story that recently came out of China. A Takedown volunteer inside China called a police station in another province. The first police officer said he has wanted to quit the CCP for a long time, but didn't know how. He asked if this volunteer could help him. When the volunteer said yes, the police officer gave his name and the CCP organizations he had joined. The volunteer used his family name but gave him an alias for his given name. Then, instead of hanging up, the officer said there were others in the police station who also wanted to quit. It took 1 hour and 49 minutes, but one by one, the phone was passed from one officer to another. In total, 104 police officers quit the CCP. They were each given an alias for the given name after they explained the CCP organization they had joined. The renunciation was taken individually from each person. Everyone who quits the CCP is able to get their statement of withdrawal outside of China to our online database. For example, earlier this year, we read on Radio Free Asia a news report about the 1,000 people at the dyeing and the weaving factory in Hunan province that they quit CCP. These people quit the CCP by announcing it publicly to the media. There are other similar situations. Many people have received non-commentaries and have been a strong desire to quit, but they did not know how to. So they write a simple statement of withdrawal on a piece of paper and post it publicly. We consider all these various ways of withdrawing from the CCP to be valid, but they are not added into our count of 220 million. Our count only reflects those who have been able to submit their statement to our online database outside of China. We believe there are more people in China who have quit the CCP but have not, in fact, been included into our count. Takedown is truly rescuing Chinese people. It is also rescuing China by changing the hearts and the minds of the Chinese people. We hope one day that number on the wall will include all 1.5 billion people rather than only 220 million. To achieve that, to bring freedom to the Chinese people, we need your support. We need the support of people from all over the world. Takedown is China's best hope for peace. Supporting Takedown is supporting the Chinese people. It's supporting freedom for all Chinese people. Thank you. 谢谢大家。
All right. Thank you, Ms. Yi. All right, so our next speaker will be Mr. Richard Fisher. He is a senior fellow on Asian military affairs and the former vice president of International Assessment and the Strategy Center. Worked on Asian security matters for 20 more years. Thank you. Oh, okay. For the PowerPoint.
Just ask, okay. Dr. Sen and organizers of today's event, it's indeed a great honor to join you here today on Human Rights Day and to join this very distinguished panel of very brave activists, leaders like Wei Jingsheng, principled opinion leaders like Dr. Joe Bosco, and our friends. I often wonder, as just a simple exercise, how would China look today if Chiang Kai-shek had won the Civil War and had emerged victorious in 1949? I think of this picture and I think of how history evolved in Taiwan. Taiwan, of course, remained an authoritarian society for the next 25 years or so. But then Chiang Kai-shek's son, or Chiang Kai-shek's son, Chiang Ching-kuo, started a process of democratization, a process that today has yielded a raucous, some would say chaotic, but at its essence, a free society. Yes, there are many cross currents. There is a existential challenge from China, but one could easily imagine that China would have, under the nationalists and Chiang Ching-kuo, experienced an even faster transformation. That today China would have its own brand of pluralism, democracy. The Falun Gong would be one of thousands of private organizations seeking their own goals, going about their own business, not challenging or being viewed as a challenge to the central government. China would be a leader, possibly a global leader. And perhaps even I would be working in Shanghai. But what I would like to do today is just provide some brief background on what is really happening. How China has evolved, as we've heard, 70, 80,000, 80 million dying under the period of Mao. Instead of welcoming the opening to the West, welcoming the West, China has become its increasing enemy, starting with the democracy on Taiwan. And yes, China is now getting ready to export violence and very likely oppression. And I would like to simply explain how what that comprises today. Next slide, please. Okay, slide after that. Xi Jinping started his term in 2012, immediately embracing the phrase called the China Dream. Xi interprets the China Dream kind of loosely, but we are fairly certain that he drew this concept from a PLA colonel who wrote a book, The China Dream. The author, Lieutenant Colonel Yu Mingfu, recently visited Washington, D.C. I didn't have the pleasure to meet him, but I've read his book, and it is basically a recipe, an agenda for how China can become what it always says, what the communist government always says it will never become, and that is a global hegemon. That is the essence of the China Dream, according to Lieutenant Colonel Yu Mingfu. In addition, for decades, we would hear, and we still hear, ritual pronunciations from Chinese leaders, usually the foreign minister, that China will never seek hegemony. China's actions are never directed, its military actions are never directed against others. But we also receive very broad hints that the truth, as we suspected, is something of the opposite. One of my favorite bellwethers is a professor at Fudan University, Dr. Deng-Xing Li, who told a British newspaper in the middle of this year that basically China is going to become a powerful country, eventually more powerful than the United States, and that today the United States is a superpower. It can do whatever it wants. When China is a superpower, the world will also have to accept. What will it have to accept? He doesn't say, but next slide, please. One of the most important ways in which the Chinese government is defining its international character and how it is going to project itself into the world as it gathers more economic and military power is through its ambition to militarily dominate, take over Taiwan, and dismantle the democracy there. This has been a constant goal through the history of the communist regime. It hasn't tried. There have been ebbs and flows in, especially during Mao's time, in their readiness to conquer Taiwan. But that ebbed during the 80s. But in the 90s, it became a front and center goal, especially after the near revolution in Tiananmen Square. It has become the Communist Party's goal, as some academics assert, to make the world safe for the Communist Party dictatorship, to seek wherever possible to promote changes, to create pressures that force the rest of the world to accommodate to the regime in Beijing in ways that lessen the inherent challenges in other countries to that regime, be it end its relationship with Taiwan, to persecuting the Falun Gong, agreeing to increasingly unequal economic relationships. But it's the preparations, the ongoing preparations to take Taiwan that are really very blatant, scary, are at the center of the Asian region's anxieties about China, at the center of anxieties here in Washington, and which could actually happen. An invasion of Taiwan, of course, would be very difficult, but the PLA is preparing for this. Now, people on Taiwan have proven time and time again that they want to live in peace with the people of China. They have exported vast amounts of investment capital, were a major part of the engine of China's growth in the 1990s. They want to live in peace and prosperity with their neighbors. But that's not good enough for the regime in Beijing. The democracy in Taiwan is viewed as an existential threat, and that it undermines the legitimacy of the regime in Beijing every day it survives. Next slide, please. Likewise, China must control the East China Sea and the South China Sea. The historical claims to these regions do not exist on firm legal legs. There has been hundreds of opportunities for China to achieve at least its economic goals in both of these regions through negotiation and agreements. My view is that China's goal of taking over the South China Sea began when China started developing its second generation nuclear ballistic missile submarines back in the late 1960s. So in my view, China had 40 years to work out some kind of accommodation for its security interests and economic interests with the other major countries, literal states of the South China Sea. It chose not to do so. It instead waited until it deployed a requisite level of military strength that it could intimidate and begin to expand, and it is on the path to imposing control over these two seas. Other countries around those seas aren't going to just sit there and do nothing. They're organizing, they're arming, they're imploring the United States to get involved, Japan to get involved, forcing Australia to get involved. But for China, for the Chinese Communist regime, control of the South China Sea is essential in order to make its strategic projection military base in Hainan Island viable. Hainan Island will host about half the future nuclear arsenal in the submarines. It will host future aircraft carrier and amphibious projection units. It will also host China's newest space launch facility that will be used to carry Chinese to the moon, or more specifically, to carry the People's Liberation Army to the moon and beyond. Next slide, please. In the East China Sea, in the last 2 years, China has very ominously allowed military academics to revive old claims to the Ryukyu Island chain, a chain which has been occupied by Japan for a period. Okinawa was occupied by the United States, but it was returned to Japan in the 1970s. Yes, there are many Chinese who view these islands as Chinese territory. But again, for decades, China has had endless diplomatic opportunities to gain the economic benefits of this region peacefully with Japan, but it has chosen not to. It is posing an increasing threat, starting with the Diaoyutai Senkakus. If it occupies those islands, it will lead to a war with Japan. And for China, I don't believe it will stop at the Senkakus. It will go down to the Sakishimas, and when it takes those islands, it will be able to pose an even greater threat to to Taiwan. And that, in my mind, is a real goal, is a real possibility, a real goal. Next slide, please. China is also arming very quickly to take on the United States. The United States is viewed in Chinese military documents as enemy number one. It has assembled what we call anti-access, what the Chinese call counter-intervention capabilities, moving from first generation to second generation and possibly even third generation capabilities. We're just looking at the DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missile, about a 1,500 range missile with a unique capability to actually intercept a moving ship. A very impressive capability, assisted by espionage. I can explain that. But this missile, not too long after it began its service, is being supplemented by the Dongfeng 26, which has twice the range. It too is now armed with an anti-ship warhead, taking China's ability to sink large ships from the first island chain to the second island chain. ICBMs are moving into multiple warhead varieties. Bombers are coming along. By the middle of the next decade, China will deploy a global range strategic bomber, probably a stealthy flying wing. Next slide, please. China has also been a leader in the proliferation of nuclear and missile technologies. They've gone about this in a very sly but deliberate way. They've more or less empowered a network of rogue states, North Korea, Iran, and Pakistan, to obtain bits and pieces of missiles or nuclear technology or nuclear processing technology that they then share, trade, sell amongst themselves. So that very soon, all three will be nuclear missile states. North Korea and Iran are on the cusp of becoming nuclear missile states, or at least the U.S. intelligence community believes that North Korea's nuclear ICBM to be operational. Pakistan's nuclear intermediate range ballistic missiles have been operational for over 15 years. And it's my opinion that Chinese military technology continues to flow to North Korea and Iran, and is increasingly the basis for Pakistani military modernization. Next slide, please. In terms of broad export of power and influence, it's very curious that Xi Jinping's One Belt, One Road initiative of massive infrastructure investments across Eurasia emerges after China, Russia, and other states more or less firmly establish the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as a viable semi-alliance. Its main activity is military exercises and counter-terror cooperation, but its character is clearly anti-democratic. It's, to me, it is not a coincidence that One Belt, One Road is seeking is designed to seek greater Chinese economic power to build on the political power that it has built through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Next slide, please. Here we have some images from the Peace Mission exercise of 2014. Largely a firepower exercise featuring Chinese forces, some Russian, a smattering from the other SCO members. But it's curious, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is usually called the Dictators' Alliance. It's not a stable construct. There's great suspicion between China and Russia. Russia deeply fears that China has designs on Russian territory, on large portions of Siberia. Right after this exercise, in which Russia sent about 1,000, 1,500 troops, it held its own exercise that comprised of about 50,000 troops. It gives you an idea of where Russia's priorities lie, even though Russia and China are cooperating increasingly again in terms of military technology, military systems after a hiatus because China stole so much from the Russians. The Russians have again started the sale and transfer of military technology in order to promote export of Russian petroleum, which Putin sorely needs the revenue. But the Shanghai Cooperation Organization really doesn't produce much except a greater sense of security for the largely authoritarian member states. Next slide, please. In Latin America, where I've spent some time studying China's actions, there is a very deliberate and broad effort, especially over the last 15 years, to build economic and commercial power upon which to develop political power. And this is already beginning to transition, in some places, into military power. China is increasingly one of the main economic props for Cuba, Venezuela, their Bolivarian alliance. Over the last 3 to 4 years, China also made a very strong attempt, especially earlier this year, to become Argentina's major military supplier. Luckily for the Argentine people, a new government is taking charge, has been elected. It hopefully will not share the authoritarian designs of the Fernandez government. It will reconsider deals that are pending with China. The Chinese were essentially hoping to arm Argentina to start a second Falklands War. Hopefully the new government has different priorities in terms of its relationships with London that don't include war. But the Chinese were down there. They made this attempt. Terrible thing that would have diverted American attention, resources, possibly strained our alliance. And the weapons that China would have sold Argentina might have made a huge difference, might have enabled Argentina to actually sink Britain's new aircraft carriers. They're that good. Next slide, please. In terms of actual power projection, China is now thought to be building its second aircraft carrier, and it has designs for eventual nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. Next slide, please. Amphibious projection forces are being built up. An initial force of about 12 large amphibious ships is expected by the mid-2020s or so. That's a substantial force. That allows China to choose conflicts, choose regimes to support or not to support, take down. Next slide, please. And air power projection is also high on the agenda. There was a report that came out of China's National Defense University last year suggesting that China should acquire up to 400 of its C-17, new C-17 size transports. That's a very large military cargo, military personnel transport capability. Again, giving the Chinese regime the ability to deploy forces globally in support or against regimes, other governments. Next slide, please. And then finally, China's ambitions are not limited here to greater power, to hegemony on Earth. China is also seeking hegemony in outer space. In a couple of days, we might read in Chinese newspapers about the confirmation of the announcement that China has created a new space force. It's something that PLA watchers have been expecting for many years. Rumors are now out on Chinese web pages that this decision has been made, and we even have a name of the new commander. He used to be in charge of the satellite launch base where all the anti-satellite missiles have been tested over the last 8 or 9 years. So from the beginning, China's Space Force will be military in character. It will control China's manned space program, and all aspects of China's space program will be dual use, meaning they will also serve, in addition to a civilian, an economic, a commercial, or a scientific mission, they will all serve military missions as well. Take for example, the space station that China will be launching starting in either 2018 or 19, probably. A space station that was influenced by technologies obtained surreptitiously from Russia. It looks like early Russian space station designs, and it will be dual use. Here we see a module that has openings that point out to space and down to Earth. It will carry instruments that will be searching for nearby satellites, possibly military satellites, as well as providing reconnaissance and surveillance of Earthborne targets. Those modules are designed to be replaced as needed with modules that might contain weapons. Space planes will be dual use. They'll start coming online early in the next decade. And then either in the 2020s or probably by the early 2030s, China will start sending men, women to the moon. This too will be another leap for the People's Liberation Army. Moon bases will be dual use. China will begin the process of militarizing the moon, challenging other countries to do the same to protect their interests. The moon will become the ultimate high ground in our mini Earth-Moon system. And as far as I can tell from statements by Chinese entities, space companies, by Chinese military leaders, there will be this military projection into outer space starting with the moon. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank Mr. Fisher.